After 4 years of running every front-of-house operation at my father-in-law's restaurant, he handed my job to his college roommate's daughter the week she graduated. She'd never worked a dinner service in her life. I packed my things without making a scene. "She'll be wonderful with the guests," I told him, and I meant it the way you mean something when you already know how the story ends. The chair across from my father-in-law's desk was the kind that looked expensive but sat wrong, too low, tilted slightly forward so you always felt like you were about to slide off. I'd noticed that years ago and never said anything. My husband Owen sat to my left, very still, the way he got when he was trying not to exist in a room. "We're going in a new direction with guest relations," my father-in-law said. His name was Harold, and he had the voice of a man who'd spent decades believing his own press releases. "Tatum's going to bring some fresh energy. She just finished her hospitality degree, top of her class, Tatum." Harold's college roommate Doug had one daughter 23 years old, who I'd met exactly twice at holiday gatherings. She'd seemed pleasant enough. She'd also spent both dinners on her phone. 4 years of arriving 2 hours before open to walk the floor personally. 4 years of learning that Mr. Abernathy from table 12 needed his water glass refilled every 8 minutes or he'd grow visibly agitated but would never ask. That the Kowalski family celebrated every anniversary at the corner booth and expected a single white rose left on the table before they arrived. Mrs. Kowalski had mentioned it once, offhandedly 3 years ago, and I'd written it down that same night, that our biggest corporate account, Prescott and Lamb, always booked the private dining room the last Thursday of every quarter, and their managing partner took his coffee with exactly half a packet of sugar, not a full one, because he was watching his intake since his bypass surgery. These weren't just preferences. They were the architecture of trust. "I understand," I said, and Owen finally looked at me, held my gaze for about 2 seconds before his eyes slid away toward the window. That was when I understood everything I needed to. He'd known. Maybe not for weeks, maybe for just days, but he'd known something was shifting and he hadn't said a word. He'd come home to dinner and asked about my day and sat across from me in our kitchen while I talked about a new seasonal menu rollout, and he'd said nothing. The paperwork was handled quickly, which told me it had been prepared in advance. Harold mentioned a severance figure with the practiced smoothness of someone who'd rehearsed it. I signed where I was supposed to sign. I thanked his assistant on the way out. Walking back through the dining room felt strange. The lunch crew was setting up, folding napkins into the little peak shapes I'd taught them my second week on the job. Nobody made direct eye contact. Carmela from the host stand gave me a look that was trying to be neutral and failing. My office, former office, was small, tucked behind the bar, just enough room for a desk and a filing cabinet, and the framed photo of the restaurant at its opening that Harold had given me on my 1-year anniversary. I took the photo down. I took my coffee mug, the one that said I survived the Valentine's rush, that the kitchen staff had given me as a joke after the year a pipe burst and we served 200 covers with no running water in the bathroom. I took the small cactus I'd bought at a farmer's market and named Gerald. And then I opened the bottom drawer. Tucked behind a box of spare printer cartridges and a restaurant supply catalog was a navy blue composition notebook, the kind with the marbled cover. I'd started it during my first month, thinking I'd use it for scheduling notes. Instead, it had become something else entirely, a record of the human details that never made it into any reservation system. Birthdays and dietary restrictions, yes, but also. Mr. Abernathy's wife had passed 2 years ago, and he ate at our restaurant every Wednesday because they used to come together. The Hendersons always ordered the salmon for their daughter because she was the one who'd asked them to try it years before she moved to Seattle, and ordering it still felt like having her at the table. Doug Prescott from Prescott and Lamb kept a photo of his late mother in his jacket pocket and had mentioned her every single time we spoke, always casually, always as if she'd just been on his mind. I slid the notebook into my bag, some things you don't leave behind for the next person to stumble across. Tatum appeared in the doorway just as I was closing the drawer. She was wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my first paycheck here, and she had the particular brightness of someone who's never had to work for a room's approval. "I just wanted to say I'm so excited to work with your team," she said, and her smile was genuinely warm, which almost made it worse. "They all seem amazing." "They are," I said. "They'll be patient with you." She took that as a compliment. I carried my box out through the back entrance, past the walk-in coolers and the dish station, and none of that felt right, leaving through the back. But I didn't want to walk back through the dining room again. Outside, the afternoon was gray and a little cold, the kind of October day that can't make up its mind. I sat in my car for a few minutes without starting it, the notebook pressed against the side of my bag. I started the car and drove home. The first call came 3 days later. I was on my couch with a cup of tea and Gerald the cactus on the coffee table when my cell rang with a number I recognized immediately. Prescott's and Lamb's main line. "Is this Waverly?" The voice belonged to Doug Prescott's assistant, a woman named Bet who'd been with him for 20 years and had the energy of someone who had personally survived multiple recessions. "It is," I said. "I'm so glad I found your personal number. I'm calling because we have our quarterly dinner next Thursday, and we've been trying to confirm some details with the new contact at the restaurant. And, well, there seems to be some confusion about the private dining setup." I asked what kind of confusion. "She's suggesting we use the main dining room because the private room is booked for a birthday party." Bet's tone was carefully professional in the way that conveyed deep displeasure. "We have had the private room reserved on the last Thursday of every quarter for 2.5 years. I didn't say what I was thinking. Instead, I said, "The private room was definitely available last I checked the calendar. There may just be a communication issue. I'm sure it'll get sorted." "I'm sure it will," Bet said in a voice that suggested she was not sure at all. By the end of that first week, Carmela had texted me 4 times. She asked Mr. Abernathy if he was ready to order before he'd even looked at the menu. Then, she called the Kowalski reservation the anniversary couple to their faces. He didn't look pleased. Then, Doug Prescott's assistant called twice. Tatum told them the half-sugar thing was a strange request. The 4th message was just a long string of the grimacing emoji. I put my phone down and went to my kitchen. I'd been meaning to bake for a week and hadn't gotten around to it, so I pulled out butter and brown sugar and the good vanilla extract I kept in the back of the cabinet. I made snickerdoodles using my grandmother's recipe, the one I'd been tweaking since I was 12, and while they baked, I sat at my table and wrote cards on the plain cream stationery I'd always used for personal correspondence. I wrote to the Kowalskis about their upcoming anniversary. I mentioned the salmon and that I'd always loved watching them order it. I didn't make it about me. I made it about them. I wrote to Mr. Abernathy and mentioned that I hoped Wednesday evenings were still treating him well. I asked after his garden. He'd told me in the spring that his dahlias were finally coming in the way he'd always wanted. I wrote to Doug Prescott and mentioned I'd been thinking about a story he told me about his mother's cooking, specifically her pot roast, and asked if he'd ever tracked down the recipe. I boxed up snickerdoodles with each card. When Owen came home that evening, he found me tying ribbon around the last box. "Who are those for?" he asked, setting his bag down. "People I care about," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "You know you're not supposed to contact the restaurant's clients." I looked at him. "These are personal cards to personal friends. Some of them have been coming to that restaurant since before I worked there. It could look like you're interfering with what?" He didn't have an answer for that. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen counter looking at the boxes, and then he said, "Tatum's been struggling a little. Adjustment period." "Adjustments take time," I said, which was true. "She's getting a lot of feedback from regulars." He hesitated. "Some of it's not great." I kept tying ribbon. "You were better at it than she probably expected," he said, and I understood that was the closest to an apology I was going to get that evening, so I set it aside and served dinner. Carmela's updates continued. I hadn't asked for them. She'd started sending them on her own, and I'd never told her to stop. Tatum introduced herself to the Hendersons as their new account manager. They looked confused. She tried to upsell the Prescott group on a new tasting menu. Bet called to confirm their usual was still available and spent 10 minutes on hold. She forgot to pull the wine Harold had prearranged for a client's anniversary. The busser caught it. Crisis averted, but it was close. Then, about 2.5 weeks after I'd left, a message came through from Carmela at 11:30 on a Tuesday morning. Tatum told Mr. Abernathy, "We don't do custom water service. Waverly, he asked for you by name. He wants to know if you moved to a different restaurant." I sat with that for a long time. That afternoon, I drove to the restaurant. Not through the front. I parked in the lot across the street and called Carmela's cell. "Can you step outside for 10 minutes? She appeared at the side door, 4 minutes later, still holding a stack of menus she'd been wrapping. "It's not great in there," she said without preamble. I figured. What's actually happening? Carmela set the menus down on the hood of a car. She was 26 and had started as a hostess 2 years ago and was one of the sharpest people I'd ever worked with. She cataloged the situation with the efficiency of someone who'd been mentally preparing this briefing. Tatum had restructured the reservation confirmation system and accidentally double-booked 3 tables on a Saturday. She'd handled a complaint from a regular so poorly that the woman had posted a 3-star review for the first time after 40-some visits. She'd told one of the servers that his section looked chaotic in front of guests, and she'd apparently gotten into a disagreement with the kitchen about expo timing that had resulted in 2 dishes going out cold to the same table twice in 1 week. "Harold's been in his office a lot," Carmela said. "Owen comes by at lunch sometimes. He looks tired." I looked at the building. The sign above the entrance was the same dark green it had always been, with the name in clean serif letters. I'd helped Harold pick that font 6 years ago, before I was even working there, when he'd asked Owen to bring me along to the meeting with the designer because you seem like someone with taste. "Is Mr. Abernathy still coming in on Wednesdays?" I asked. "He came last week. He sat at his table and he was fine, but he left earlier than usual." "Okay, I picked up my keys. Tell him if you see him that I said hello. Personal message, not professional." "I can do that." I drove home and made lemon poppy seed muffins because Mr. Abernathy had mentioned once that his wife used to make them on Sunday mornings. I packaged them in a small box with a card that said simply, "Thinking of you, Waverly." I included my personal cell number at the bottom. He called me 2 days later. "I don't like to complain," he said, which was how he opened every conversation, even when he was clearly about to. "But the young lady called me Hon." "I'm sorry," I said. She means well, I think." He paused. I got used to certain things." "You were always easy to get used to," I said, and he made a small sound that I think was a laugh. We talked for 20 minutes. He told me about the dahlias. I told him about the snickerdoodles and that I'd been experimenting with a cardamom variation. He said his wife had made something like that at Christmas. I asked him to describe it and I wrote down everything he said. The muffins at the Kowalskis went the same way. They called to thank me, and we ended up talking for 30 minutes about their daughter in Seattle, whom I'd never met but felt like I knew from years of their stories. Doug Prescott's response came by email to my personal account, formal but warm. "Your note arrived on a difficult week. My mother would have liked you. I hope you land somewhere that deserves you." I read it 3 times. Owen came home on a Thursday looking like the last few weeks had worn him down to the wire. He dropped his jacket over a chair instead of hanging it up, which he never did. "The Prescott Group is asking about transferring their account," he said. "Oh?" I kept chopping the vegetables I was working on. "They want to find another restaurant that understands their needs." He sat down heavily at the table. "Bet specifically requested your contact information. Harold told her you were on an extended personal leave. I'm not on any kind of leave." "I know." Owen looked at the table. "He's trying to save face by lying to your best client." He didn't respond to that. The Abernathy situation isn't great either. He came in Wednesday and asked to be moved to a different server and then left without finishing his meal. "He's been coming to this restaurant for 6 years. I put down the knife. "Owen, did you know ahead of time?" He looked up. "When your dad made this decision, did you know before he told me?" The pause before his answer was about 2 seconds too long. I heard something, he said finally, a few days before. I thought he was still deciding, but you didn't tell me. I thought it would work itself out. I looked at him for a long moment. There were a lot of things I could have said. I thought about the Wednesday nights he'd come home and asked about my day while already knowing. I thought about the meeting in Harold's office where he'd studied his own hands instead of looking at me. I made dinner, I said. It'll be ready in 20 minutes. We ate without talking much. I think we both understood that we were in a different place than we'd been before this started, and neither of us was ready to name it out loud yet. Harold called my cell on a Saturday morning, which was a choice. I was in the garden pulling up the last of the summer annuals when my phone rang with a number I recognized and hadn't expected. Waverly. His voice was different than it had been in his office, less composed, less certain of itself. I hope you're doing well. I'm fine, Harold, I said. How are you? Well, look, I'm going to be direct. I've been getting some calls from long-term clients expressing concern about service continuity. The transition has been bumpier than anticipated. I didn't say anything. Tatum is working hard, he continued. She's a smart girl. But there are some relationship dimensions of this work that she's still developing. Relationship dimensions, I repeated. The clients some of them feel like they don't have a point of contact they trust. A pause. Doug Prescott called me personally. Said some things I found difficult to hear. I pulled a dead marigold from the soil and set it aside. What did he say? He said, and I'm quoting, that his experience with your restaurant over the last month had made him question whether you understood the meaning of the word hospitality. Harold cleared his throat. He also said, and I thought this was interesting, that he'd received a personal note from you that was one of the finest pieces of communication he'd gotten all year. I waited. I'd like to know if you'd consider coming back on, Harold said, in a senior capacity, overseeing client relations at a higher level. We could structure it however makes sense. The October air was cold enough that I could see my own breath. Harold, I said, when you let me go, did you think about what would happen to the people who'd been coming to that restaurant because of me specifically? Silence. Mr. Abernathy comes in every Wednesday because your restaurant was the last place he and his wife went together before she got sick. He kept coming because someone there knew that and never made him feel like a transaction. The Kowalskis have been celebrating their anniversary at that corner booth for 9 years, and they stay because someone ordered that white rose without ever making a production of it. I paused. These aren't customer service wins, Harold. These are people. He didn't speak. I'll think about what you've said, I told him. Thank you for calling. I hung up and stood in my garden with dirt on my gloves and the notebook image in my head, all those pages of names and dates and small human details that I'd taken with me. Some things couldn't be recreated from a training manual. That evening, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and started a document. I wrote down every client relationship I'd built over 4 years, not to use as leverage, but because I wanted to see it laid out in front of me, the actual shape of what I'd made. The Prescott and Lamb dinners, the Kowalski anniversary table, Mr. Abernathy's Wednesdays, a retirement party I'd quietly coordinated for the wife of a city councilman that went so smoothly she'd cried when she thanked me, a fundraiser dinner that I'd managed essentially alone after the event coordinator broke her ankle the morning of. Owen came into the kitchen around 9. He looked at my screen. What are you doing? Thinking, I said. He sat down across from me. Dad called you. He did. Are you going to go back? I looked at my husband. He looked back at me, and this time he didn't look away. He didn't stand up for me, I said. In that meeting, you didn't say a single word. Owen's jaw tightened. I know. I don't need you to defend me from your father. I need you to be in the same room as me when it matters. I kept my voice even. That's what partnership is. You're right, he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard. No qualification, no excuse. Just, you're right. I should have said something. I've been trying to figure out how to say that without it sounding like I'm just saying what you want to hear. That's exactly what it sounds like, I said. But I'm listening anyway. We sat there for a while in the kitchen that smelled faintly like the herbs I'd roasted that afternoon. The Prescott Group is definitely leaving, he said finally. Bet confirmed it today. 8 years. I know. Dad's panicking. Tatum's talking about going back to event coordination. I think she knows it's not the right fit. She's not wrong to think that, I said. She might be excellent at event coordination. Owen looked at me like I was a puzzle he'd been working on for 20 years and had only recently understood was three-dimensional. You're not angry at her. She was put in a position she wasn't ready for by people who should have known better. I closed my laptop. I don't have energy to waste on being angry at Tatum. 2 days later, Carmela texted. She put in her notice. Clean exit. No drama. She actually seemed relieved. I felt a complicated sadness about that. For the girl who'd walked into something that had looked like a gift and turned out to be a setup. For the versions of this story where young women got handed things they hadn't been prepared for and paid the price for someone else's decision. November arrived gray and quiet. I'd taken on some freelance event consulting. A friend of a friend needed someone to manage a company holiday dinner for about 80 people, and word had gotten out through channels I hadn't engineered. A corporate client I'd never worked with directly reached out after being referred by Doug Prescott. I took the call. A week before Thanksgiving's, a box arrived at my front door. No return address, just my name and the careful script I recognized from years of thank you cards I'd received at the restaurant. Inside were 6 jars of homemade peach preserves and a card in Mrs. Kowalski's handwriting. We thought you'd like these. Our daughter sent the recipe from Seattle. She said she made them last summer and thought of you. We never told her about you, so we thought that was interesting. I stood at my kitchen island holding a jar of peach preserves and cried for about 3 minutes, which I hadn't done once through any of the rest of this. Owen found me drying my eyes when he came in from the garage. What happened? I held up the jar. He looked at it, then at me, then sat down at the island. Tell me. So I did. I told him about the Kowalski's daughter ordering the salmon at every visit, and about Mr. Abernathy's dahlias and his wife's lemon muffins, and about Doug Prescott's mother in the jacket pocket, and about the Navy notebook and every detail I'd kept in it for 4 years. I told him what that work had actually been. Not managing tables and handling reservations, but something closer to keeping a record of people, making sure they felt located in a world that moved very fast and sometimes lost track of them. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, I didn't know that's what you were doing. Neither did I said. Not in words. Harold still wants you back. I know. Are you going to go? I looked at the row of peach preserve jars on my counter, 6 of them, from a woman I'd never met who'd learned a recipe from her mother and thought inexplicably of a person she'd never known but whose name she must have heard in her parents' stories. I'm going to call Mrs. Morrison, I said. She was a client I'd worked with for years, a widow who ran a small estate management firm and who'd reached out twice since I'd left. I promised her I'd think about some consulting work. I've been thinking. Owen nodded slowly. And I'm going to think about what I actually want to build, I said, not what someone hands back to me. The word hung there in the kitchen, not quite a decision yet, just the shape of one. On a cold afternoon the following week, I met Mrs. Morrison at the coffee shop she favored, a quiet place in an older part of the neighborhood with good light and no music. She was 71 and had the precision of someone who'd been underestimated for decades and found it useful. She had the Navy notebook open on the table when I arrived. I'd sent it to her the day before with a note because it was hers as much as mine, those pages. I looked up 3 names in here, she said by way of greeting, and all 3 of them are still working with that restaurant. For now, I said. For now, she agreed. She folded her hands. I have 3 colleagues in my building, a financial planner, a tax attorney, and someone who runs a small property management company. We have discussed on several occasions that what we collectively lack is someone who understands how to maintain client relationships the way, she paused, the way you do. I sat down. I'm not talking about going to work for a restaurant, she said, anticipating the thought. I'm talking about something you build, a small firm, client relations, consulting, event management takes. I'd be your first client. She smiled. I have very specific preferences. I know you do, I said. I know that you know, she said. That is the point. Outside, the November light was thin and clear, the kind that makes everything look a little bit new. I thought about the notebook in her hands, all those careful pages of the things that mattered to people. I thought about 4 years and all the Wednesday evenings and anniversary roses and half packets of sugar, and about how none of that had belonged to a building or a job title. It had belonged to me, to the part of me that paid attention, that remembered, that understood that the whole architecture of trust was built from small specific acts of caring that nobody ever required you to perform, but that made everything else possible. Tell me about your colleagues, I said. She opened a folder she'd brought. We talked for 2 hours, and by the time I left the coffee shop, I already knew the names of her tax attorney's grandchildren, and the financial planner's preference for meetings before noon, and the property manager's complicated relationship with email. I drove home and opened the laptop and started writing. Not a plan, not yet, just notes. The shape of something that had always been there, waiting for me to understand it was mine.